Manawaker Studios Flash Fiction Podcast is supported by patrons on Patreon. To find out more or to add your support for as little as $1 a month, visit patreon.com/Manawaker. Welcome to Manawaker Studios Flash Fiction Podcast. I'm CB Drogi. This week, Ruby Red and Rich as Sin by Shenoa Carroll-Bradd. The doorbell rang. Uncle Wallace smiled. His children were home. He flung open the door to a cheerful chorus of "Trick or treat!" 3 children stood on his porch, dressed as a robot, a fairy, and some sort of zombie pirate. He smiled at them, and at their parents, who waited against the railing. "Well, happy Halloween, everybody. I've made something extra special just for you." The children wiggled like puppies as he leaned away from the door to fetch their treats. The tape on his bandaged arm pulled as he stretched, and Uncle Wallace hid a wince when he returned to the door with a bowl of store-bought candy. The children sank back on their heels, deflated, while the parents frowned at each other. "But," the little robot said, "what about your candy apples, Uncle Wallace?" Everyone in town called him Uncle, adopting him as their unofficial relative after the death of his wife and children 2 decades back. At first, some had called him Grandpa Wallace, but he didn't take to that. "Never had any grandkids, never will. Still got nieces, though, so call me Uncle." He laughed and set down the bowl. "Gotcha, didn't I?" Uncle Wallace reached again, this time grabbing a basket of bright red candy apples, each lovingly wrapped in cellophane and tied with a ribbon. The children surged forward, holding out their bags and pillowcases. Now, don't rush. I always make plenty." He winked at the parents before putting 2 apples into each bag. Young or old, it didn't matter. Everyone loved Uncle Wallace's candy apples. "Thanks, Uncle Wallace," said one of the mothers, a pretty blonde with half-hearted liquid eyeliner cat whiskers. "Happy Halloween." He looked closer, squinting in the fading twilight. "Amy Rose, is that you? Goodness, how you've grown. I remember when you were just this tall." He hovered an arthritic hand over the zombie pirate's tattered bandana. "Do you still eat taffy by the pound?" Amy shook her head as the other parents waved goodbye and moved on with their kids. "No, Uncle Wallace. I've cut refined sugars out of my diet, except once a year for your candy apples." The fairy thanked him and skipped over to her mother, digging in her bag for the treats. Amy accepted one and rolled it between her palms. "Just like I remember. They're a little touch of Halloween magic." She placed the apple back in her daughter's sack, but then frowned and pulled out a plastic sandwich bag of chocolate chip cookies. "Oh, our new neighbor was handing these out. Could you throw them away for us? I don't like Casey eating homemade stuff. There's no telling what might be in there." "Of course." Uncle Wallace accepted the dubious cookies. "Thanks," Amy smiled, distorting her drawn-on whiskers. "I've been meaning to ask if you don't mind. How do you make your apples so good?" "Well, you see, Amy, I believe in this town. I believe in family and only feeding your loved ones the best." He made a show of squeezing the chocolate chip cookies into crumbs, though it made the bandages tug again. "So I get my apples and honey from Stoudbaker Farms on the edge of town, and they set aside the plumpest pomegranates for me every year." He leaned in and lowered his voice. "That's how I get them such a lovely red without artificial dyes." Amy Rose grinned. "That's wonderful. Organic, locally sourced, and community-minded. I wish more people cared as much as you do." She gave him a brief hug before leading Cassie, the fairy, down the road to the next house. Uncle Wallace shut the door and sank back into his easy chair, absently scratching at the bandages under his shirt sleeve. He felt a little guilty for not telling Amy the whole truth, but that was often for the best. Better not to tell children you've sneaked vegetables into their spaghetti or used non-fat sour cream. The truth was, he put a little of himself into each batch of candy apples. After losing his family, Uncle Wallace had felt isolated and abandoned, and the cure was clear. Make a new family. 90% of the town ate his candy apples on Halloween, So every year for the last 2 decades, Uncle Wallace carefully cut himself and bled into the candy syrup as it cooked. The resulting apples were gorgeous, a deep rich red, and the candy sweet and tangy, with just a hint of salt, like the fancy Fleur de Sel caramels at the mall. This way, he was part of them, and they were all part of him. Every person in town was his family now, and they all loved him so. The doorbell rang. Uncle Wallace smiled and scratched at his bandages. His children were home. This has been Ruby Red and Rich as Sin, written by Shenoa Carroll-Bradd, and first appearing in One Hellacious Halloween Volume 1. For more information about Manawaker Studios' other projects, including books and games, visit manawaker.com, which is also where you should go to learn more about the authors featured on this podcast or to get details about submitting a story. The Flash Fiction Podcast theme song is by Kevin MacLeod. Manawaker Studios' Director of Dice is Ben Baston. I'm CB Droege. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at CBDROEGE. Thanks for listening. On the next installment of Manawaker Studios' Flash Fiction Podcast, only the perfect and lucky would be sheltered, the scientific best chances for the best of humanity to survive.